It's alive! Today on the Home Winemaking channel, we've got a spooky topic to talk about, and that is wild fermentation, or some might call it spontaneous fermentation. If you take some grapes or most any other fruit and crush them into a juice and let that sit at room temperature for a while, one way or another, a fermentation will start. That juice is going to try to turn into wine. The question is it going to be a good wine or not? In a lot of cases, it's really not. There's a lot of things out there that can ferment in grape juice. That being said, some really incredible wines can be made by natural fermentation. And today, what I'll try to cover is some things you can do to de-risk the process. Oh, hey Molly. There's a lot of reasons why a wild fermentation like this is really spooky. The first being that it just might not start at all. You might just let this wine sit here only to find that it just never really gets off the ground and gradually starts to oxidize. So you always want to kind of have a backup plan, be ready to bail. If this doesn't get going within about maybe 5 days, you're going to want to pitch your own yeast starter into it and get that thing fired up. The other thing that could happen is that it might get started, but get started with a really, really bad yeast strain. In the wild, there are thousands of strains of yeast and many, many different species, a lot of which are just not good for wine at all. This book is from the 1950s and is filled with 700 pages of yeast, and only one of which is known to ferment well in wine. That's Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That species has all of the strains of wine yeast that you would get in a yeast packet. So you can do some things to try to improve your chances of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or wine yeast, being the yeast that ultimately takes over this fermentation. This must has been sulfited at the crusher, and what that does is kind of stunts back most any wild yeast. Most wild yeast don't have a good tolerance to sulfur dioxide, or SO2, but wine yeast does. It actually produces it as a kind of a way to be competitive against these other yeasts. So by adding something like 50, maybe 60 parts per million of free SO2 at the crusher, you're kind of giving a slight advantage to wine yeast. If you think that a bad yeast is fermenting, you're probably going to want to add, again, a yeast starter of one of the most competitive yeast strains you can find. Something like EC1118 that will outcompete just about anything. And you'll notice funky smells and things, like really funky smells. That would be a time when you say, maybe it's time to bail here again. Something you can do to, again, kind of de-risk this whole thing is to kind of do a pre-fermentation. So if you've got your own vineyard, you can pick, say, 5 gallons worth of grapes, or make, a small 5-gallon batch, and let that start to ferment a few days ahead of when you actually plan to harvest your grapes. And if everything's going well, first of all, that gives you some confidence that that bigger fermentation will go well. But the other thing it does is, if that big fermentation doesn't really want to get started, you can use that 5-gallon batch as a giant yeast starter to get everything off the ground. Most wild yeast really won't take a fermentation past about 3 or 4% alcohol. So there's this huge risk that wild forms of wine yeast never really do take hold, so the wine could stall out at say 3 or 4%. So if that happens, maybe time to bail, add your wine yeast. You kind of just have to always be watching and be ready for what could go wrong. And if you need to bail, bail. In most cases though, wine yeast will be in the wine to some extent. It's really the minority out there, but it doesn't take much. 1 or 2 little cells could be enough to establish a full fermentation. So it's whether it comes from the wild or even just the wild yeast floating around in my basement here, because we make a lot of wine, it's probably going to get in there somehow, and it's probably going to get this fermentation going. This particular fermentation lagged for about 3 days before really any signs of fermentation happened, and it also kind of struggled at that 3 or 4% range. And I'll talk about later some things that I did to try to get through that without issue. Now it's just about done, and really it's heading in a really good direction. Oh boy. It's been 3 days, and I've since pressed that wine and racked it off the gross lees, which can get a little bit funky, especially with a wild fermentation if you don't get that wine off them after you press. All in all, it took 20 days from me kind of starting this fermentation until I pressed it, which is a really, really long skin contact time for a red wine, and I normally can't get that long if I'm using a more reliable or aggressive yeast strain by inoculating it myself. So that really extra long fermentation in combination with this lag time is one reason why this wine could end up a little bit better than something that I might do with a cultivated or cultured yeast. And during that lag phase, you get somewhat of an enzymatic breakdown in addition to these yeasts and potentially even bacteria breaking down the sugars. So again, it could make the wine just a little bit more complex. We'll find out later as this wine ages. The fermentation on this has been, I will say, a struggle. It has been fighting me all along the way. So I've been fighting some hydrogen sulfide, so that's that kind of sulfur, rotten egg smell that can happen when a yeast gets stressed or a wine gets air starved. So I've been really trying to splash that wine up when I punch down. I've been putting just a sheet over it to try to give it as much air as possible. I've also been feeding the yeast. So yeast needs nutrient, it needs nitrogen to just reproduce healthily and just ferment in a healthy way so it's not creating these off gases. So I use some Fermade K. If you want, you can use Fermade O if you want to keep this as kind of natural as possible. That's an organic yeast nutrient, which is really very similar to Fermade K. And I also use some DAP, diammonium phosphate, which is basically really, really good source of nitrogen, but I would say almost too good. It's kind of like giving yourself candy versus a meal. But it is helpful if you're trying to quickly kind of fix that hydrogen sulfide issue if you've already kind of detected it. I've also been fighting a little bit of ethyl acetate, which is that nail polish remover smell. It's one form of VA or volatile acidity, and it can also happen when a yeast gets stressed, and it can also be the byproduct of other fermentations happening in parallel, whether they're bacterial or just less ideal wild yeast strains. So again, I'm just trying to give that wine air, let whatever's fermenting in there be healthy. These yeasts will produce less esters like that when they are in contact with a little bit more air and well fed, and also if they're in the temperature window that they want to be in. Wine yeast likes to be in this, say, 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's something I did to kind of make things more risk-free, is warm this grape must up to about 72 degrees right away. A lot of these spoilage yeasts like to ferment more around 60 degrees. So you give the wine yeast a little bit of a competitive advantage by getting it there I did let it get into the 80s. I normally like to get up to about 85 or so for a red wine. I let it get there, but I didn't let it stay there very long because you could pretty quickly tell that it was stressing that yeast more than I wanted based on the smells that it was producing. So this less than perfectly clean fermentation, it could, again, contribute to some more complexity in this finished wine. It's been a roller coaster of emotions, but I think as long as everything is in check, I'm not getting a crazy amount of hydrogen sulfide or a crazy amount of ethyl acetate, I'm just getting whiffs of it. This could, again, like in the end, that little bit of VA, volatile acidity, can create a little bit of a fruitier aroma. That little bit of hydrogen sulfide can help bind up anthocyanin or color components. It can also help bind up some of these funny off flavors. So these can kind of be contributory factors to these big, long, benzene ring type structures in a wine that can contribute to mouthfeel, texture, complexity. We don't really know. And what I'm going to do is compare this wine to a wine that's from the same grapes, the same 80-20 blend, but it's fermented with cultured yeast. So as time goes on, I'll be comparing those two wines, and you can follow that on my Patreon page, patreon.com/makewine, and we'll see which one do I think turned out better. I'm certain that the one that was fermented with cultivated yeast will be a good, clean wine. There's no doubt about that. But this one, having this microbial oasis, all these random things in there that are each creating their own little off flavors, it could be pretty interesting. I looked at this through a microscope to just try to see if there were odd things in there that were pretty clearly not wine yeast, and I did see that. There was a pretty complex variety of wild yeast in there. After about 5 or 6 days though, you saw just all these little round ball looking yeast, which is kind of a characteristic look of wine yeast. I think we did do that standard thing where once you hit 3 or 4% alcohol, the only thing that can really keep going is wine yeast. What's next for this wine? Well, I have racked it off the gross lees, as I said. I've splashed it up pretty good, which is something you want to do if you are catching little whiffs of hydrogen sulfide, and the wine really is still very air hungry at this point. So I'm not quite yet afraid of air, but I will be soon. I've got it into topped up carboys, and I'll be adding malolactic bacteria. Now, if you want to go all natural, you can try to count on wild malolactic bacteria doing its thing in there, but to really count on that, you probably should have not sulfited before fermentation, and that's a little bit more risk than I really wanted to take. So I'm choosing a strain of malolactic, which is called CH16. It's very reliable, and it's going to take this wine through malolactic fermentation. I'm also going to start adding oak to the wine. I'll probably use medium toast French for the most part. We'll see, maybe towards the end I'll jump into a little bit of medium plus. I like to add that in the form of oak cubes if I'm working in carboys. When malolactic fermentation is complete, I'm going to go ahead and sulfite this wine. It's still going to have any problem that any other wine would have, and maybe even a little bit more than other wines would have, because I was kind of allowing some of these potential other yeasts to kind of establish themselves early on by not throwing a competitive yeast in there to basically outcompete them. So I'll sulfite. I usually like to give one pretty heavy dose right at the end of malolactic fermentation. That'll carry me all the way through aging, and then I'll test the free SO2 at the time of bottling, make any subtle adjustments if needed. I can do a couple of things as far as oxygen contact goes during aging. I can use rubber stoppers with glass airlocks, which is going to be about the most oxygen tight container that I can do with a glass carboy. But this one, because there's all this kind of complexity, I want to provide, I kind of want to essentially micro oxidize it like what would happen in a barrel. So I'm going to use, early on I've got these silicone stoppers, which I'll use for maybe the first 10 days of malolactic fermentation. The silicone is not particularly good at blocking air, but it's better than something like just covering it with a paper towel. Next I'm going to transition into normal rubber stoppers, but I'm going to use plastic airlocks because I want that tiny bit of air permeability. So over the 12 to 18 months that this is going to sit in a carboy, it's going to get little tiny bits of air. Not enough that it's going to really oxidize the wine, but enough that it'll allow it to kind of mature itself better, smooth itself out, round out those rough edges that are happening from all these crazy complex, microbial things, but also from that 21 days of skin time. 21 days is a long time, which means lots of tannin. And what rounds out lots of tannin is lots of, I won't say lots of air, but a little bit of air. One thing I will mention is I would not try to do what I'm doing here. If it's your first time ever making wine, maybe don't try to do this. I think you want to really have a good handle on how to steer a wine that starts to go a little bit astray on you. And one thing that's for sure is these wild fermentations can easily start to go astray. Also, I wouldn't do this on a white wine. Even just in that lag phase while you're waiting for the fermentation to start, that white wine's probably going to turn brown. And white wines are just so delicate. The flavors, the aromas, they're very delicate. So by doing this wild fermentation, it's probably gonna completely run over all those nice delicate things that you want in that white wine. If you have a lot of experience doing wild fermentations, I'd love to hear any suggestions from you in the comments, especially if your wine doesn't taste like salad dressing. I think there's a lot of winemakers out there that they're very anti-science and insist that they've got these incredible wines, but there's also a lot of winemakers that are basically making glorified vinegar or really sherry tasting wines, which is maybe not something that we're shooting for if we're trying to win medals in winemaking. I hope this video wasn't too spooky for you. If you want to help support the Home Winemaking channel, check out these awesome hoodies that I've got here. You can buy those by clicking on one of the little links in the bar below the video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.